All right, so we are in the book of Esther, getting close to the end at this point. We left off in chapter 9 of Esther, and we've talked about the fact that the Jews, once they had the edict that favored them defending themselves, that not only did they defend themselves, but they had destroyed their enemies. They were assisted in doing this by the provincial and local governments. And that even going a step further, then in Susa itself, the capital city, that Esther was able to get the king's permission to give the Jews an extra day to kill all of their enemies there, as well as permission to hang the bodies of Haman's, was it 10 sons, 12 sons? 10, yeah. It's one of those numbers where, you know, the Bible likes 10s and 12s and 3s, and so anyway, Haman's 10 sons. If it's a little, I asked last week why they would have hung them if they were already dead. One thing you do have to remember, we do have to remember, is that in many cases these stories are not, even though the author here is definitely making an effort to make it linear from the standpoint of telling the story, sometimes aspects of this are not always entirely linear. And so it's possible that they were actually taken alive, and it was sort of jumping ahead by saying they killed them when in fact the hanging was what was going to kill them. But regardless, their bodies are hanging as a message to those who are not, those who are enemies of the Jews, that this is what happens if you go up against the Jews. And so the Jews get an extra day in the citadel or in Susa to kill people. And so they had killed 500 men the first day. They killed 300 more the second day. And then if we pick up in verse 16, and we read this last week, but I just want to kind of pick up here because it helps to kind of feed into the next part of it. The rest of the Jews who were in the king's provinces assembled to defend their lives and rid themselves of their enemies, and killed 75,000 of those who hated them, but they did not lay their hands on the plunder. So a total of 75,000 across all the provinces, plus 800 there in Susa itself, are the ones that they're dealing with. Now, we talked last week a little bit about why that extra day might have been important, because the concern is in particular to deal with the enemies that might be close to the seat of power there in Susa. But 75,000, that's quite a lot of people, and it probably was comprised of people who either through action, either they were ones who had tried to go up against the Jews on that day when they had the king's edict that allowed them to do that, or who through action or word had made it clear that they were enemies of the Jews. And as we saw with Haman, where he is an Amalekite by his heritage, it's likely that the people that were mostly enemies of the Jews and that the Jews ultimately took their vengeance or took action against were also primarily people who had long-standing feuds with the Jews, long-standing hatreds with the Jews, the same way that the Amalekites would have. And so these are probably enemies that were, because remember, the Persian Empire is composed of all of the area that includes, I should say, all of the area that Canaan and the lands around that were the nations that Israel invaded and conquered when they conquered the land of Canaan, as well as some of the lands that they moved through in the process of getting there. So a lot of these nations that are part of the Persian Empire, particularly at a distance from Susa, are going to have people in them who have long-standing grudges against the Israelites because of that process and that event, even setting aside any sort of anti-Semitic kinds of feelings that they might otherwise have. So that's probably what we're seeing happening here. Okay, so and we talked a little bit last week about the significance of the fact that the Jews did not take advantage of the opportunity to plunder their enemies. Where it seems likely that that a significant motivating factor for the people who were going to go up against them was the plunder, and in particular the possibility that a lot more people would join in than just the ones who really hated them because they were in it for the money or for the plunder. The Jews are not interested in that. They don't take advantage of that. They simply leave that where it is. And I think maybe it was Ken who made an analogy back to relating back to some of the conquests of the Israelites where they were ordered not to take the plunder, whether it was in Jericho, the Amalekites when Saul was sent out against them and they were supposed to destroy everything. In certain situations there was this idea that these are holy things, that these are things that are not for the people, they're to be set aside to the Lord. In this case, they may have viewed it in that way as well, in terms of seeing that this was a rescue that was coming from God. So perhaps they recognized that as being deserving of special reverence or something like that. So, okay, so throughout the provinces of the empire, it says this was done on the 13th day of the month Adar, and on the 14th day they rested and made a day of feasting and rejoicing. But then it says the Jews who were in Susa assembled on the 13th and the 14th. That's because they got that extra day to kill people of the same month, and they rested on the 15th day and made a day of feasting and rejoicing. Therefore, the Jews of the rural areas who lived in the rural towns make the 14th day the month of Adar a holiday for rejoicing and feasting and sending portions of food to one another. So they actually, I guess, I don't know exactly, like, do they mail it to each other? Or, I mean, how does that work exactly? You know, oh look, I got a leg of a lamb in the mail. I'm not quite sure what to do with it. Oh, it's from Frank. Oh, thanks, Frank. So anyway, so this is the event. So there's a day of rejoicing and feasting and partying, and so here again we have this list of all the different feasts that are going on. Actually, the banquets. This is not a banquet, I guess. These are just feasts and rejoicing. Okay, could I get somebody to read for me verses 20 through 22?
And Mordecai recorded these things and sent letters to all the Jews who were in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, both near and far, obliging them to keep the 14th day of the month of Adar and also the 15th day of the same year by year, as the days on which the Jews got relief from their enemies, and as the month that had been turned for them from sorrow into gladness and from mourning into holiday, that they should make them days of feasting and gladness, days for sending gifts of food to one another and gifts to the poor.
Okay, so Mordecai sends out instructions saying, basically, we're going to make this a formal holiday, or a formal, I guess holiday is a good word for it, for celebration and stuff like that. Why would they be sending, I mean, I asked this kind of in humor, but why is there's the sending of portions of food to one another? What in the world is that about? Do you think?
Mine says presents. It doesn't say food.
Okay. Presents.
Mine said gifts of food.
Okay.
You know, so they were sharing. I mean, you know, just like probably, you know, at Christmas time, people bake all kinds of sweets and stuff and send it to people and give it as gifts.
Okay.
Well, how far were they sending it? Just
Well, see, I mean, that's what I was thinking is,
yeah, exactly.
Exactly.
Everything was perishable then.
So take some cookies to the neighbor next door is very different from, like I said, I'm going to mail a leg of lamb across the empire and see, what it's like when it gets there, or something like that. So,
right.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is. I think there's kind of two elements to this. First of all, there is that idea that the sharing and the, like you guys said, sending something locally to, to a neighbor or whatever like that, just a gift kind of a thing. But also this has, I think, a relationship to the concept of the tithe. Ken, were you gonna?
Yeah, I was going to say, have you ever heard of Hickory Farms? Or Harry's Fruit?
Yes, I have.
You can send a gift, literally a gift of fruit once a month for a whole year. So it's just a way to remember what happened and share with each other the rejoicing. I mean, food is always associated, not always, but typically associated with a time of good times and fellowship together.
Yeah.
And then they wrapped in with Mordecai's instructions, don't forget the poor.
Right.
It's also something near and dear to God's heart. There's over 200 references to God's concern for the widows, the orphans, and the poor throughout the Old Testament.
And go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, and mine I've got a footnote down here. It says the exchange of gifts of food demonstrated the unity of the people and their care for one another and helped them to spread an atmosphere of joy for everyone celebrating the festival.
Okay. And I think what I started to say, and I think it ties into both of these ideas, is one of the things that you find in the Old Testament, we look at this it's probably been a couple of years ago now that we were looking at the tithe and some of the things, how that worked. But when the Israelites tithed, the way that it worked was that you took your tithe to Jerusalem on an annual basis. And because your tithe was generally animals and fruits and vegetables, things that had grown, the tithe was primarily composed of farm products because that's what most of the Israelites did. And so they would bring those things up there, and when they got there, they would all gather together and have a huge feast together. And then all that was, in addition to that, which was the vast majority of it, because I don't care how much you eat, you can't eat, that much all at one time. The vast majority of it then was what went on to the Levites and to the priests. But the idea was that there was this communal together time once a year where the tithe was shared and where there was this relational kind of a thing that goes on. And part of the tithe was taking care of the poor, making sure that the Levites got a portion because they didn't have any land allotted to them and stuff like that. And so I think that there's a degree to which this is kind of relating to that as well. That idea of, annually, we don't have a temple to go to anymore. We don't necessarily have a tithe to make anymore, but now we've got this event where we can celebrate and we can kind of do some of the same things that we do in the tithe to kind of share with one another and to recreate that community sense that can be very difficult to preserve when you are one of many nations that's scattered throughout a giant empire. So I think there's an element maybe that sort of harkens back to that, even if it wasn't necessarily specifically the idea there. It certainly seems to have some connections to that. Okay, somebody read for me verses, sorry.
Before we leave
Yeah.
that, something just occurred to me, it never really dawned on me before that this was taking place throughout that empire, which spanned a large area. And so we get the sense that the Jews did not just stay in Judea or Canaan or any of that. They didn't stay in the homeland. They moved. They distributed themselves throughout that empire over time.
Well, they kind of had to. They were, deported. So
Well, yes, in those instances.
yeah.
But that was more localized to Assyria.
Well,
Babylon. This
so
implies that they're spread throughout that entire
Right.
empire. So they immigrated places and built up their own culture
Right.
in all these different nations.
So so what had happened initially was you had the initial deportation, and that was to some extent throughout the empire. But you're absolutely right. Many of the Jews had chosen to go back once they were authorized to do that by Cyrus, and they had gone back. But the vast majority of the Jews we know historically stayed in the empire. What was Babylonia then became Persia. And also the Jews that had been assimilated by Assyria became part of that as well, because this Persian Empire eventually conquered the Assyrian Empire, or overtook it is a better way to put it. And so eventually, the Jews continued to move throughout the empire. They didn't just stay there as long as they had to, and then all of them went back to Jerusalem. There were many of them that did, and as you say, they took advantage of opportunities. They took advantage to spread out and stuff like that. And so the Jewish people were not just located in one place, and they had moved all throughout the empire by this time. So now the greatest portion of them is congregated in and around Judea, even at this point. And it's kind of interesting because we don't really necessarily think about this, but this whole series of events included those people that would have been there in Judea as well. And probably of all of the people in the empire, they would have been the ones with the most enemies to worry about, because there were some people who really didn't like the fact that the Jews had gone back and rebuilt the wall of Jerusalem and that sort of thing. And so they probably, more than almost anybody else, needed the permission to defend themselves and the assistance of the local governments and stuff like that to deal with the enemies that they would have been surrounded by. So it does include everybody there. Okay, somebody read for me verses 22 through, let's see, where are we going? 22 through 28.
So the Jews accepted what they had started to do and what Mordecai had written to them. For Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to destroy them, and had cast pur, that is, cast lots, to crush and to destroy them. But when he came before the king, he gave orders in writing that his evil plan that he had devised against the Jews should return on his own head, and that he and his sons should be hanged on the gallows. Therefore they call these days Purim, after the term pure. Therefore, because of all that was written in this letter, and of what they had faced in this matter, and of what had happened to them, the Jews firmly obligated themselves and their offspring, and all who joined them, that without fail they would keep these 2 days, according to what was written at the time appointed every year. That these days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation, in every clan, province, and city, and that these days of Purim should never fail to fall into disuse among the Jews, nor should the commemoration of these days cease among their descendants.
Okay.
I'll go untie my tongue after class.
There was a few words in there that were kind of twisty, so this paragraph serves as both kind of a summary of, here's where we are, and then the actual establishment of this permanent celebration, memorial, whatever you want to call it. And of course, it's named Purim because of the pur that Haman had cast, the lot that he had cast in order to determine what the best day and date was to carry out this attack against the Jews. So it becomes the name of the holiday, or it becomes the root of the name of the holiday in memorial of that. And it's kind of interesting because they're choosing to use the word that was used, that was the thing that was used to try to create this harm to them. They're using that as the name that they give it. And I think it's kind of interesting because that's something we see with the Jews. They celebrate the Passover feast, and that's basically a celebration of a fairly gruesome kind of thing. The killing of lambs and wiping blood around, and then the death of a whole bunch of firstborn children and adults and everything else. And there's a celebration about that because God's deliverance comes through that. And it's interesting when you think about God's deliverance, a lot of times comes not only through great trial, but also through great, upheaval, I guess. There's momentous things that come along with what God does, and sometimes that means a lot of people end up dead. Sometimes it just means some huge event takes place, but there is usually something big when God delivers in a big way. So.
And is the Lord's Supper really any different?
No.
It was a major event, but a very gruesome event. It's at least part.
Yeah. Because we're celebrating the sacrifice, the crucifixion of Christ, and
the resurrection.
It
ended up good, but it started poorly.
Yes, it started poorly. That's a good way to put it. So, I'm sorry, that image popped in my head. Okay. So it's interesting that when you think about the Lord's Supper in particular, we're talking about the body and blood of Christ that we are symbolically taking. That is kind of a gruesome thing when you think about it, But, and in fact, we have the Catholic tradition. It's even more gruesome because they believe it literally turns into the body and blood as you take it. What's that?
It doesn't.
And it doesn't yet. I'm aware that the theory is flawed. I'm just telling you that's what the actual doctrine says. So it is interesting that in this country, rarely do we build monuments to failure or to bad things happening. The vast majority of our monuments are to people who did great things or to great successes. When you go to Europe, though, you find monuments to bad things. There are plague memorials, for example. It creeps me out. But they build these memorials, and it's basically like just a whole bunch of souls, bodies and stuff like that, kind of ascending up towards heaven. And it's to memorialize plagues that took place. And they have other things like that. It is kind of un-American. It's unusual for us as Americans to celebrate failure or to celebrate something bad happening. It is not at all uncommon in most other cultures, even the one we came from in Europe, but certainly beyond where many of us came from. I guess I shouldn't generalize too much there, although you're all probably from Europe, just looking at your skin color. But anyway.
There's some that feel that Confederate was...
You could make an argument that some of the Confederate monuments are, but the thing, so as a what would I call it, a proponent of the Union, I would look at the Confederate memorials as being a monument to failure. But if you ask somebody who is in favor of keeping those up and thinks they're really great, they don't think of it as a commemoration of failure. They think of it as a commemoration of greatness and and things like that. And so, but you're right. There is an element of that in the South, in particular. This this memorialization of this failure, which they have in some ways turned into almost a ritualistic idea of some greater principle or cause, could be seen as sort of a version of that. Ken?
I was not aware of the thing in Europe, but on this continuum you presented, where would you put the Vietnam Veteran Memorial?
That's actually an interesting one. That probably is much more in that vein, because it is not, certainly it's not a commemoration of victory. It would be, I think, a commemoration of sacrifice, if you were to,
In a losing cause.
in a losing cause, yeah. So that's true. I think that's probably and one of the reasons it was so controversial is because of exactly that it was a losing cause. It was very, very difficult to get the money and the approval to actually build that monument, as opposed to the other ones for the different wars, Iwo Jima and different things like that. And then when they created it, the initial response to it as being so unlike the other marble and tall, impressive memorials was also got a negative reaction initially. So that's true. Yeah.
Well, I was gonna say, I don't look at the Lord's Supper as, that's victory. We have Memorial Day. That, there's a lot of people that died that we're supposed to remember, and that what they gave for us, and just because you win a war doesn't mean that that's, necessarily, we lost a lot of lives during that and stuff. There's like in Chandler, when my granddaughter was in the ROTC down there, as a freshman, they did a Memorial Baton Death March. To me, that's not, that wasn't a victory. Those guys were in prison camp for 3.5 years. I know because my dad was in that, and he was in that Baton Death March. But they still remember that every year and do a walk in honor of that.
Yeah.
And so there are things that we do remember, and 9/11. They have stuff. They remember that.
That's true.
So, I think it's kind of, we have both.
That's true. And really where I was originally going with this, and I kind of got myself sidetracked, was more not the idea so much that Purim, for example, is not a celebration of a disaster. It simply incorporates the idea of the bad in with the good to actually bring out the good thing that happened. The Lord's Supper is the same way. The Passover is the same way. But it does call attention to the fact that while God does save, sometimes He saves through fire, and sometimes He saves through great difficulty and great trial. And I think that's really more where I was going, and I got myself off track with that kind of indirectly. But there's a degree to which almost any celebration of a victory does incorporate a recognition of the sacrifices that were made to achieve that victory, the losses that were suffered and things like that, to a greater or lesser extent. There's an element of that, I think, and you're right. I wasn't really thinking in those terms. And really what I was thinking more about was in Europe, where they have celebrations of, or not celebrations, memorials to just a bad thing that happened, where we don't necessarily do something quite like that. But in any event, okay, so they've set up this holiday, this 2-day holiday or memorial that's supposed to be remembered throughout every generation. And indeed, actually, it's probably in some ways historically been celebrated more consistently than a lot of the other holidays or memorials that were set up, because all of those involve the temple or being in Jerusalem. And so it's very problematic to have the Passover when you can't actually sacrifice anything, or the Feast of Booths, or some of those different kinds of things, because they're supposed to happen where the tabernacle or where the temple is, and they're supposed to take place in a group function that the Jews don't have access to anymore. And so today, the Jews do have a symbolic celebration of some of those things, particularly in Israel itself. But by and large, what's interesting to me about Purim is that it is it's a much more modern memorial in a lot of ways, because the situation that creates it happens in the more modern era, outside of the notion of we've got our own country and we've got our own laws and we can do what we want to do. And so it is set up in a way that makes it so that it can operate in any place. It doesn't depend on having control of a temple and being able to offer sacrifices. And so Purim is kind of an interesting sort of bridge between the old Jewish and Israelite situation and a more modern one in terms of dealing with the more modern world. Jerry?
How do you think God looked at Mordecai setting up a holiday?
Well, that's an interesting question. We've talked about this a little bit before with the book of Esther. Since it doesn't even mention God in it at all, there is no effort made by the author to try to moralize about what's happening. Now, there's no question that the author is setting up the heroes and the villains, because, I mean, we just read Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agag, the adversary of all the Jews, schemed to destroy them. I mean, use words like scheme to talk about bad people and adversary and things like that. So he definitely sets up the good guys and the bad guys. But you don't see anything in Esther that basically says this was the right thing to do, this was the wrong thing to do. And that's true with a lot of the books of the history. The judges in particular, other than the comment at the beginning and the end that everybody did what they thought was right in their own eyes, there's really no statement ever made, oh, this was the right thing to do or this was the wrong thing to do, unless one of the characters in one of the stories actually says it.
That's what I was really asking is, do you think God approved, that's not even the right word, do you think God accepted that as a
legitimate
national holiday like Passover?
And I was getting there and taking a long way around, but I understand. But the point that I was making with this is, in some of the books, like the books of the Chronicles, the Chronicle writer goes out of his way to moralize about the kings and what they were like, and good or bad. But Esther doesn't get that much like some of these other books do. So it's actually very difficult to tell what God would think about this. And so, you know, I don't have a good answer to that, to be perfectly honest. I tend to think that he's okay with it because it was his deliverance of his people, and it's not as though Mordecai is elevating this to the level of one of the feasts, one of the, you know, the holidays that involve sacrifice. He's not creating any sort of rituals around it, you know, giving gifts and things like that, but nothing like, you know, ritual sacrifices or things like that. I think you start doing that sort of thing and you start running into some much more dangerous territory, because that is the province of God, of the law, of the priests, and not just of some dude who's in charge of a lot of stuff.
I think if you are, I would think that they would have an attitude of thankfulness that God had saved them from this disaster. And, you know, to me, as long as they're honoring God, I think he would be fine with that.
Yeah.
You know, and praising him that they were rescued from this.
It is interesting that there again, because the book doesn't mention anything about
Yeah.
God. Technically, we don't know for
Yeah.
sure. But it's reasonable. Again, we're inferring reasonably, number one, that God was responsible for this, and that the Jews would have recognized that aspect of it as well. So
because why would they fast and stuff before she went into the
Right.
king if they weren't requesting, you know, help in that?
Right.
And so
Yeah.
to me, he's been very involved in this, and they just haven't said so.
Yeah. And we're going to actually, perhaps today, but if not next week, we're going to talk about why it is that the author may have chosen not to invoke God's name in the process of writing this, but we'll get to that later. But so I guess, like I said, Jerry, I would say, as long as it is a matter of a not secular celebration, but a celebration that doesn't involve, you know, sacrificial aspects, doesn't involve, you know, well, certainly worshiping idols, yeah, that would get you into trouble. But I think that you kind of, there's kind of that distinction there, to me at least, is if you start setting up stuff where you are calling for new sacrifices, or you're calling for some kind of a special kind of a worship or whatever, then you start to get into an area where I think God would be a little less okay with you just doing whatever you want to.
Can we use it as a principle in today's world in any fashion?
The setting up of the holiday?
Yeah. I mean, it seems to me like it's something that they put together to honor God. I mean, if we want to go down to that simple of a statement, that they were doing something to honor God. So in that case, you know, is a potluck supper that we put together that we're giving thanks to God similar to that event.
I mean, I think that's true. It's not quite as elaborate
No,
or as annual, but yeah, I mean, certainly, and it's not just in Esther. We see this in many places where when something good happens, there is a celebration that takes place, and it usually involves gathering people. It usually involves food for the reasons that Barbara already brought out. Usually, so there's definitely, I think that it is definitely something we consistently see with God's people, that when good things happen, there is an opportunity that's taken to celebrate that. And one thing, you know, I think in terms of a principle here is that making sure that you remember why you're doing that. You know, we don't just get together and we're all having a good time because we're having a good time. There's the remembering aspect of it as well, and using that as an opportunity to reinforce to people the good things that have happened. So, Barbara?
Is Christmas any different? That's a man-made setup.
Well, right.
Holiday that is supposed to be honoring Christ's birth.
I think the problem with Christmas is more that supposed to be part that you just said. You know, when we have a potluck fellowship, we're usually pretty, you know, there's not usually quite as much confusion about, you know, secular aspects bleeding into it, but and commercialism bleeding into it and stuff like that. But I would agree that broadly speaking, things like Christmas and Easter are, if they are remembered in the context of celebrations of what they're about, the birth of Jesus, the resurrection of Jesus, that there is definitely a validity in doing something like that to help you remember, as long as you can keep that as the focus. And that it's interesting because it's actually going to come later in the Jewish history, but Hanukkah is going to be established in many ways on a similar principle to what's been done here. And Hanukkah, for a lot of modern day Jews, has taken on a lot of the same elements of Christmas, where it's more about gift giving and some of those kinds of things, and focusing on lighting the menorah without necessarily spending that much time talking about the religious aspects of it. I'm not saying that's a universal thing, I'm just saying that happens. So whenever you start to add a significant element of, I think you start to add a significant element of secularism to your holiday, whether you mean to or not, it tends to bleed in more and more of the things that have you forget about what you're really celebrating. So it's trickier. Ian, you had raised your hand a while ago.
Yeah, I just back to what Jerry was saying, or was asking about if God was, you know, okay with this holiday being created. Old Testament God had a habit of he was more apt to smite people when they were doing things that he didn't like. So that didn't happen.
That was my first thought to answer Jerry's question. Was, well, Mordecai survived doing it, so probably exactly. God was okay with it. Right, but that said, the reality is that when you look through the book of Kings, for example, there's a lot of very, very evil kings that God did not directly stop from doing what they were doing. So it's always a little dangerous to say that. But yeah, I think the fact that, you know, that Mordecai comes out of this, you know, and continues to be rewarded and elevated would tend to suggest that God was okay with what he'd done. So.
Also, to what Jerry said, this is the only book in the Old Testament this holiday is mentioned.
Yeah.
It's not mentioned anywhere else.
Well, there wouldn't be very many books that it could have been mentioned in, because most of them would have been written before this one, but still.
Probably.
A few of the minor prophets is about it, actually. But yeah, that's true. It is only mentioned there. But interestingly, it's one of the ones where we have a more, historically speaking, there's a greater clarity as to the fact that it was established and actually started happening in a relatively clear period of time, whereas most of the older laws, it's very unclear historically how well the Jews even followed any of those rules while they were in the land, except during some of the kings, where they were very specific about honoring them. So,
do they still observe today?
You mean like Purim?
Yeah.
Yeah, they do. Yeah, so Jews do still celebrate Purim, as well as Hanukkah. And like I said, they do celebrate the Passover in a more limited fashion, and they do certain things to try to honor things like the Feast of Weeks and stuff like that. But it's more of a symbolic thing than it would have been during the time when it was originally instituted. So, Steve.
Well, it's always interesting to me how Jesus comes and he condemns them for creating all these extra layers in the law and then making it doctrinal and all of that. And so I think as I try and balance whether or not some of the Christian holidays, as we call them, like Christmas or Easter, things like that, that are not in the Bible, whether or not using that as part of our worship. It's one thing to say, I see it out there, I recognize that Jesus was born, all of that, but to make it a part of our worship, I think we need to really consider whether or not we're like Nadab and Abihu with strange fire, whether or not we're creating something that we're just positive God's going to like, when really it's a feel good for us.
Yeah. Yeah, there is a line that we walk when it comes to holidays in general, because of the thing we see in the New Testament talking about don't let anybody bind holidays on you. Now, if you know what they're writing about, they're talking there about Jewish teachers, Jewish Christians who are trying to force Gentile Christians to follow the Jewish traditions and the holidays and stuff. But still, that idea, to me, we default back to, when we're talking about that kind of stuff, that idea of Christian freedom, that we're supposed to be free in Christ, and that means that nobody is supposed to bind on us things that are not bound on us by the Scriptures, by God Himself. And so in this situation, you can see where Mordecai's right up against that, because on the one hand it says that it established and made a custom for them to do this. On the other hand, that they would not fail to celebrate these 2 days. That's a pretty heavy-duty custom, as a practical matter. And so, when you create a custom that creates an expectation that everyone's going to follow it, it's hard to call that anything other than, a new set of rules or new rules. So it is something where we have to be very careful, and particularly today where we don't have any, I think, legitimate, or at least I've never encountered anyone who had a legitimate claim to some sort of a special revelation beyond what's in the Scriptures that would give them the authority to say, I have this new thing and now you all have to do it. I think we have to be really careful when you have that kind of a mindset where somebody is saying you have to do something, and maybe they're saying it's in the Scriptures, but you go and look and it isn't really there. Then there's a problem there when they're saying have to, as opposed to this might be a good thing to try or something like that. We have to be really careful with that. Jerry?
I guess in my mind it becomes a precedent or a principle of, if I, as the head of my family, wanted to set up the third Thursday of every month as a feast day to remember Christ for my family, and that's all that I'm doing, that's probably a good principle for it. I mean, I could do that if I wanted to. There's nothing that would prevent me from not offering praise to God on the third Thursday of every month.
Yeah. But if you try to tell the rest of the church that they've got to do it, then you've got a problem.
That's a different subject, yes.
Yeah, I think, to me, and I'm going to actually, interesting, we're going to talk about this a little bit today in the sermon. I think that we tend to be a lot too fixated on
Dogmatic.
Well, but on the group things, on some sort of rules and some sort of organizational structure through which everything is supposed to happen. And because of that, it creates the tendency towards, I think, abuses where somebody is trying to come in and say this is what everybody has to do. But it also creates an inhibition on people doing things that would be good things because they feel like they've got to get permission and they've got to follow some sort of organizational structure. And there's a difference between doing something that you know or have reason to believe is going to be disruptive or is not okay, but on the other side of it, there's all kinds of things that are okay, and we feel like we have to create some sort of elaborate system in which those things can be done. And I think that complicates the situation. And so, yeah, you know, what you want to do, how you want to celebrate your Christianity, as long as it's not incompatible with the scriptures, I don't think there's any reason why we need to go around telling people not to do that, you know, or trying to set up rules about how you can or can't do that. If you want to try to bring it into the congregation as a whole, then it's you know, that's a different question. And there again, there may be, you know, if somebody says, hey, let's have a potluck, you know, next or 2 Sundays from now to celebrate, you know, the summer and you know, how good God's been and the beautiful weather and whatever else, and we're all on board with that, then that's just fine, you know, because you're not forcing people to do that. You're just saying, let's do something like that. On the other hand, if you wanted to say, and let's make it a rule that every year we have to have this, you know, 2 weeks into June, now you've got a problem because you're making rules up, you know, and that's the tricky thing is we like to do things, and then somebody says, let's make it a rule, and that, because we're just like that, we're just messed up like that. We like rules too much. So, Betty?
Thanksgiving is a perfect example. Our country chooses to thank God for everything on Thanksgiving. And I don't think God's unhappy with that one.
maybe with how much we eat
Christmas is a
on Thanksgiving, but you know, but I don't. Yeah, I you know, you know, I think God is honored whenever we do things that are intended to honor Him and are done in a way that is respectful of Him. And the 2 ways you can go wrong with that is that you can do it where it's really all about you and what you want to do, so it's not honoring God, or you could do something that is designed to honor Him but is done in a way that is dishonorable. You know, the easiest example I can think of with that is someone who is trying to honor God by, you know, engaging in some sort of racist behavior or in some kind of, you know, somebody who thinks they got to overthrow the government because God doesn't like the government or whatever. So they would like to say that they're honoring God, but the truth is what they're doing, no matter how much they might think it's about God, is not something God wants them doing. So I think we have to, you know, there's 2 elements to that, but when those elements are satisfied, when you're doing it to honor God and you're doing something that is honorable, I don't think there's really any rule against that. It's when we start to say, and now you have to do it because it was so good the last time, you know, or whatever it is. That's when it all falls apart on us. And the biggest challenge for humans is that is so often the progression. We liked it, we did it a couple of years in a row, now it's something we have to do every year. No matter how problematic it might be, no matter how much we might have decided something else is better or whatever, we have to do it because it's what we've always done, or what we've done for, you know, several years. So, okay, we're going to stop here because we're over at the end of our time. We will finish up next week with the last little bit of this topic, kind of wrapping up Esther's story and some of those things, and then we'll talk about some of the significances of the book, which is a lot of the latter questions in your worksheet if you've still got that. We're going to talk about some of those things. And one question I do want you to kind of think about starting today and think about for going in next week is the question I mentioned earlier, which is, why is it that God is never mentioned in the book of Esther? Why would the writer have chosen to, I mean, you can only say it's a deliberate omission or a conscious omission to leave that out. Why would the author have left that out? So we'll talk about that next week, but I want you guys to think about that this coming week and give it some consideration, since it's kind of an odd question, odd situation. All right, thank you guys, and we will take a break.